live, but I'm just going to verify it on the Facebook page before we get started, just to make sure everything is working like it should. If anybody is watching us, feel free to leave any questions that you might have about archaeology, or if you have questions about the Office of Archaeological Research. If you have any, Matt Gage is here with us to answer those questions. So it does look like we are live and all of that is good. So I guess we could get started. So welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I am the communications specialist for you. And joining me for a discussion about history is Director of the Office of Archaeological Research, Matt Gage. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in if you have. We're here in the research library at the University of Alabama Museum's Office of Archaeological Research. So I'm glad we could do this.
Yeah, so we are going to be broadcasting from anywhere between 10 and 11. We'll try to make that our goal. And while we are broadcasting, feel free to ask any questions you have for Matt. Or if you want to join the live stream, you can do that too. You can actually be on video with us and ask your question that way. You just click on the link in the description. You can do it either through a laptop or a desktop computer or even your smartphone. And just as a reminder to everybody, this is live, so anything can happen. So hang in there with us in case Facebook, you have any issues. So Facebook and a lot of other websites are trying to do their best to meet the needs of online activity at this time. So just want to put that out there in case we do run into any live issues. But now that we've gotten all of that business out of the way, Matt, what are we going to be talking about today?
So today we're going to be talking about some various aspects of archaeology and preservation, and we're also going to be talking about the stories that come from archaeology and the things that we consider to be really important with archaeology. So I'm excited for this.
And yeah,
I brought artifacts along for us to talk about and kind of tie us into how we see archaeology relating to the general public.
Yeah, that's awesome. Because as far as I understood it from you, stories can be just as helpful as the artifact itself in terms of how we understand about history.
Absolutely, even more so. Archaeology is the study of material culture left behind by people. And that's great if you're talking about arrowheads or broken sherds of pottery or broken glass shards, whatever it may be. Each one of those pieces is neat unto itself, but the stories that those artifacts tell and what they mean are far more important. And one of the things that we always talk about is context for artifacts. And if you think about artifacts as just being isolated entities, that's only a minor part of the story. Each one tells, it's related to the other artifacts and how they're distributed across an archaeological site. So what we talk about all the time in archaeology is context. And when people go out and they pick up artifacts from the field, they're removing it from the context. And while they may have a really neat projectile point or artifact from is a historic site, whether they're metal detecting or what, they don't have the whole story, and they've lost the potential to get that whole story. So the analogy that archaeologists always use is an archaeological site is like a book, and every artifact on the site is like a word in that book. And if you have the whole book there and you can pick up each artifact and read it, it tells you a whole story. But if people start picking up those artifacts and removing them from their context, it's like removing words from the book. And after a little while, it gets to the point where you can't read the book and the whole story is lost. And we talk a lot about preservation and trying to preserve archaeological sites, and that's very important to what we do. So as archaeologists, it's our responsibility to be stewards of the archaeological record. And we want to make sure that people become involved in archaeology, but they do it in the right way. They don't just go out and start digging in the backyard and tearing stuff up without knowing what they're doing. And lay people are great in archaeology. They can learn a lot working with other folks, with professionals. There's societies in Alabama. The Alabama Archaeological Society is a fantastic group of folks. It's a mix of avocational archaeologists and professional archaeologists and academics, and everybody comes together and talks about archaeological sites and the things that they found, and it's a great opportunity for folks to learn.
Yeah, that book metaphor is really helpful to understand. Just so that you know, when you when you talk to somebody who doesn't understand the stuff like me, that really helps me understand how you all go about gathering information and how you piece things together. So, just want to let you know that book metaphor is very helpful.
Good. I've got some artifacts today that are from the Bank of the State excavation from downtown Tuscaloosa. If you think folks would like to take a look at some of those, we can start talking about some of those and the stories that they tell us.
Yeah, let's take.
Okay. The Bank of the State is the name of the archaeological site. It's actually 1TU 495 is the site number. And when we identify an archaeological site, we actually give it a number. The first designation is for the state that the site was found in. The second designation, the TU, is for Tuscaloosa County. And then the last designation, the 495, is the 495th site recorded in Tuscaloosa County. So for the state of Alabama right now, we have over 30,000 archaeological sites documented. And we maintain records of all of those sites, what was found at those sites, and the description of what they are. And that information helps with folks that are planning projects. And in this instance, the Embassy Suites wanted to come in and build a new hotel right there on the corner of University and Greensboro. And we have known for several decades that location had a lot of archaeological remains on it. The first Bank of the State had been on that block when Tuscaloosa was the capital of Alabama. One of the first permanent structures in the city of Tuscaloosa was on that block. It was a cabin built by John Click. There were all kinds of stories related to the Civil War on that block. There had been a POW facility in one of the warehouses that was there. There was a furniture manufacturing company that built all of the furniture for the Capitol. And then when the university was founded in 1831, that manufacturing facility built all the furniture for the fledgling University of Alabama. And there's still some pieces of furniture around the city that are from that site. So it's pretty neat. But anyways, let's talk about some of the artifacts I brought with us today. And what we're going to do is kind of go in chronological order. So we're going to talk about the early settlement of the site and how it came to be so important to Alabama. So let me don my protective gloves here.
Got to do that.
I hope everybody is doing well and avoiding COVID-19. We've got our gloves here and our trusty can of Lysol.
Got to have it.
All right. So John Click was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he came to Tuscaloosa early on and built himself a cabin right on this block around 1816, 1817. But the thing that he didn't do was get a title to the property. So unfortunately, another land speculator claimed the block that he was on, and right around the early 1820s, John Click was evicted from the property that he had built his home on. But he left behind some items for us to be able to look at, and one of them is really interesting. This is a Spanish, everything's reversed here. This is a Spanish real. Let me see if I can get it close enough that everybody can see it. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. So early on in the United States, when we were just a fledgling country, there wasn't enough currency to go around. The mints in the country couldn't print enough coinage or paper money to be able to supply the needs of the country. So instead, any coinage from any country, as long as it had heavy metal value, could be used. So these Spanish reals are really interesting. You could use those as currency in the United States right up into the mid 1800s. And about that time is when the currency was able to be printed and coins were able to be minted that could be distributed enough for the country to have its own currency. But these coins are really unusual. We've got a couple that were minted as early as the late 1500s in South America. Now, if you think about how coins travel from place to place, it's pretty amazing to think that a coin minted in either Lima or Potosi could make it all the way to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, sometime between the late 1500s and the early 1800s. Now, that's, roughly 200 and something year span where it had the opportunity to make that trip. But still, to think of that coin traveling that far at that time is amazing. And I don't know if you noticed on the surface of it I did it again, how worn down the face of that is. But after 200 and something years of folks having it in their hand or rubbing it around inside a pouch or a pocket, it's pretty amazing that you can even still see what the surface of it looks like. So what else? We know that John Click was a mason. This is a pipe from, it's a kaolin pipe. And I don't know if you can see that there is a Mason logo stamped on the front of the pipe.
I can see that. Yeah, very clear.
So that tells us a little bit more about this guy. We know that he was an entrepreneur. He had moved to Tuscaloosa with the intent of making his fortune. And when he was evicted from that block, he picked up and he moved to the Jones Valley, which is up sort of in the Bessemer, Birmingham area, and he started a mill up there. So we know that he made out pretty well in the long run, but I can't imagine how angry he was to have been evicted from his home there in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah.
So what else we got back here? Oh, when Tuscaloosa was the capital, there was a tavern on the block, and underneath the foundation of the tavern, which we found, there were 3 of these champagne or brandy bottles. We're not sure which ones they are, jammed up underneath the foundation, and they were basically celebratory bottles that were put to bless the building and its construction. Now, the story goes that the tavern owner liked to get into his own supplies. And when the legislature was in session, these guys would come in and they would take advantage of little extra imbibing that they probably weren't allowed to do at home. And they would all have get-togethers and they'd get a little inebriated. And supposedly the tavern owner liked to get naked and run around without his clothes on. So
okay,
it's pretty amazing that stories like that have lasted long enough. But you can just imagine what would happen in Montgomery if the legislature was in session and they all went to lunch and the owner of the restaurant they were at decided to run through the place naked. But
wow,
I think it would go over too well.
It was a different time back then, I guess.
Governor Ivey might not like that.
That's pretty funny.
Okay, so about the mid 1800s, 1840s, the Phoenix Furniture Manufactory was started on that block, and they were building. They actually started in the early 1800s, and then it continued up into the 1840s. So excuse me for that. But when they were manufacturing the furniture for the Capitol and the university, they were very innovative. They came up with some of the first screws that were used in this area, because before that, everything had been held together by nails. But they had bought a tool that allowed them to make screws, which makes furniture much stronger. So they also came up with a device called a gang saw. And a gang saw is great for cutting planks down to size. And it's basically multiple blades set up. So this is one of the saw blades. and they're set up spaced out, one about every 2 inches or so. And they would have been able to run a plank of wood through this saw, and each one of the blades would have cut a different section of the plank, and they would have been able to cut a big plank down into multiple little planks a lot faster than you would have been able to just by using a single saw blade. Now, the furniture manufacturing also became involved in kind of a new thing at the time that was very important for recreation, and that was the game of billiards. And billiard balls were made directly from elephant ivory. So this right here is a piece of elephant ivory that came from the site.
Wow.
And this is a scrap that you can see this nice clean edge right here where it was sawn. What they would have done was brought the billiard balls in and turned them on a lathe and smoothed them out into the balls. But there's advertisements from all the way up to Washington, D.C. about the Phoenix Furniture Manufactory's billiard balls and how high quality they are, and advertising for sale. Now, the majority of the ivory that came out of Africa to supply this endeavor was from Zanzibar. And at the time, Zanzibar was what is now several separate countries. But pretty quickly, they started harvesting so many elephants that it really depleted the population. And it's hard to think of the early 1800s people being so heavily involved in the global economy that they're bringing in ivory from Africa, they're making billiard balls that they're selling all the way up to Washington, D.C., and back to England, supposedly, and they're decimating the elephant population in Zanzibar at the same time. I don't think Big Al at the university would be really happy to learn that Tuscaloosa Furniture Manufacturing Company was involved with wiping out his brethren over in Africa. But you never know.
No, Big Al would not be happy about that. Bill Bomar says the furniture shop machines were steam powered. Do you know anything about that?
They probably would have been steam powered at the time. Everything was belt driven, and all they would need would be one. Early on, they were probably foot powered. So they had pedal power. I don't know if you've ever seen one of the old drill presses that's run kind of like an old Singer sewing machine. Has anybody ever seen one of those that has a pedal at the bottom that you pump up and down, and it causes a wheel to spin? And as it spins, it causes the sewing needle to go up and down. Well, it was the same with drill presses and saws like this. So the majority of the really early ones would have been foot powered. And then later, as time went on, they would have been steam powered. And there would have been probably a single engine that would have driven the saws at the very end. And everything in the shop would have been belt driven. So there would have been leather belts running all over, pulleys all over the building. So, yeah, great question.
Yeah, you can see a pedal-powered sewing machine at the Gorgas House Museum. There's one of those up there on the second floor.
Good deal. Well, great. One of the places on an archaeological site, a historic archaeological site, that always ends up having a really rich amount of artifacts, and usually they're intact, are privies. And everybody knows what a privy is. At least I hope they do. And if you don't, it's an outhouse. So if you think about...
I didn't know.
This is kind of a gross topic, but we've got to consider how the morphology or the geomorphology of sites and the formation of sites occur. So if you are living in the early 1800s and you're going to live on this block for a while, you're going to need a bathroom. And you go out in the backyard and you dig a big pit and you build an outhouse over the top of it. And you use that for a certain amount of time, and then your pit gets filled up, and you have to move your outhouse over and dig another pit and do the same thing over and over again. So from 1816, when this site is settled, all the way up until the city of Tuscaloosa gets water and sewer, there were plenty of privies on this block, people building outhouses in the backyards of the facilities. And one of the things that we often find in these privies are chamber pots. A chamber pot is basically something that allowed you not to have to go out to the outhouse in the middle of a cold, rainy night. You would use that as the bathroom inside your home. They had lids on them, so they were nicely contained, and they had handles. And you can see right here, where is it? Right here, where the handle is broken off. And that probably is a pretty good explanation of how it ended up in the privy. Somebody had carried it out. Hopefully they had made it all the way out to the privy before the handle broke. But almost every single one of the chamber pots that we found in privies on this site had broken handles. So that gives you a pretty good indication of how they ended up in the privy. The other thing that we tended to find a lot of were ginger bottles or beer bottles and whiskey bottles. And if you want to kind of hide your drinking from other people, the outhouse was a great place to do it. So we find a lot of whiskey bottles. We also find pocket knives. And if you think about somebody sitting down to do their business in the outhouse, a lot of times those pocket knives just slip out of your pocket into the privy. And I can guarantee you that a lot of folks were hesitant to go in after their pocket knife. The last thing I'm going to mention are keys. And keys, we find a lot of keys in those as well. And that would be the same scenario for me. I think I would probably change the locks on the house rather than go in after the keys into the privy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the most interesting privies on the block was associated with a Civil War prisoner of war facility that was put into the Drish warehouse on this block. And the POW facility was established relatively early on. These were folks from Shiloh and Bull Run that were sent into the heart of Dixie to keep them in an area that was very far from any point that they could escape to get back to Union lines. So this Drish building warehouse was a large facility that had 2 stories to it. The north end of the building was the tax in kind facility, which if you lived in the South during the Civil War and you couldn't pay your taxes, instead of sending money to the government, you could send in a saddle or a bridle or a harness or a couple of bags of flour or some other product that you could make, and it was considered as currency. So you were basically paying your taxes by providing things that the Confederate Army could use. And that facility was on the north side of the building. And then in the middle, on the second story, was the POW facility. On the bottom floor was an old printing press that was no longer in use. And the prisoners, we've got some great letters to folks at home. We've got letters to the War Department from some of the prisoners. We've got great records of the folks that were at this block. In fact, while we were doing the project originally, we were contacted by some of the descendants of the folks that were prisoners in this facility. And they had some of the artifacts that their ancestors had carved while they were in the facility. A lot of times what these prisoners would do was carve bones like ham bones and other things to trade with the guards so that they could get more food. So some of these folks actually had some items. There were some gaming pieces. There was a couple of rings that had been carved from ham bones. And they were really incredible to see. They sent us some pictures of these things, so that was great. But the folks that were housed at this facility were pretty innovative, okay? So they had managed to get out of the second floor where they were being held, make it down to the first floor where the printing press was, and they grabbed some of the printing press letters. These are all
very cool.
On the very ends of these. where are we here? On the very ends of these are letters, and these would have been set into the printing press and used to print different things, but they use them for a different purpose. At the time, Confederate currency was very similar to early American currency, where they just didn't have enough capacity to be able to produce the currency that the Confederacy needed. So every municipality was allowed to print their own currency. And if you've ever heard the term shin plasters, it refers to the really poor quality paper that was used to develop currency across the Confederacy at the time. But nobody really knew, what the currency should look like. So everybody was printing their own, and it all looked different. And if you were, moving from Tuscaloosa up to Huntsville, you might be able to take some of the currency that was printed in Tuscaloosa with you and show it to the folks in Huntsville, and they would never have seen it before, but they would just have to assume that it was appropriate currency. So these prisoners managed to get into the first floor of the building, get access to the printing press, steal some of these letters, and start printing their own shin plasters or currency. They got caught. They were removed from this facility and sent all the way up to Chattanooga, where they were being held up there. They had managed to smuggle some of the currency with them, and they flooded the Chattanooga market with this fake currency. And there's a newspaper article about how these guys got busted, and it refers to them as damn Yankees in the newspaper article, which I thought was pretty interesting. But for us as archaeologists, it was really neat. Out behind the Drish building, they talk about where the privy was located, and they talk about the military had very specific requirements for how privies were built at military facilities. And of course, this was a POW facility that conforms directly to the Confederate requirements for construction of such a feature. And there's actually a letter to the War Department talking about this privy and how close it is to the well water that these guys are drinking, and claiming that they're getting contaminated as a result of the proximity. But in the excavation of the privy is a large structure. It's I think at least a 4-hole privy, but adjacent to it is a slit trench, and a slit trench is it's not for number 2, it's for number 1, to put it nicely.
Yeah, I think we get it.
So we were excavating the slit trench, and in the bottom of it, we found all of these printing press letters. So I think it's probably a pretty good indication that some of the prisoners had been caught with the currency. They were told that they better not do any more, and they probably threw the letters into the slit trench so nobody would know. But again, it's interesting to see the stories that come from all of this, and tying the newspaper articles into the guys that came from Tuscaloosa and went all the way up to Chattanooga was fantastic.
And all right. So Matt, I'm just curious, Matt. So when you all have to go and get these stories, does that require you to interview a lot of people, or like you said, some people sent you things or told you the stories? Does that require a lot of research on your end?
If you're dealing with historic archaeology, there is a lot of background research that goes into it. And that includes everything from looking at census records and deed records to newspaper articles. And there was a professor at the University of Alabama who's since retired, Robert Malone, who is an absolutely incredible historian and knows more about Tuscaloosa history than just about anybody. And Robert was the first guy that we went to and said, hey, we really want to learn more about this block and what happened here. And he got newspaper articles from everywhere that tied in all of these stories, and it was fantastic. One of the stories that came out just after the end of the Civil War and after these guys were released from the facility was a Union soldier from New York who had been shot at Bull Run. He went home. He got a cold, and was complaining about his sinuses and got his handkerchief out and blew his nose, and the bullet that he had been shot with came flying out his nose into his handkerchief. And there was a newspaper article about
Can you imagine?
that Robert found. So, it's amazing some of the stories that come out of this. But
yeah,
the Civil War in Tuscaloosa was a very interesting time. So everybody that is a Civil War buff knows about Croxton's Raiders. And so Croxton's Raiders was a Union force that was sent all the way down through West Tennessee into the corner of Mississippi, through Alabama. And the intent was for them to work their way all the way over to the coast. And Croxton's raid was intended to take out a lot of the manufacturing facilities, the armories, the railroad bridges, other things that were really vital to the Confederate forces being able to transport and manufacture things. So when they get to Tuscaloosa, they're on the Northport side of the river, right where the bridge would have been. That's just to the east of Lurleen Wallace. So if anybody ever goes to the levee or they go to the Bama Bell, you can still see the abutment that was there for the bridge that crossed over the river. And the home guard was guarding the bridge. And they started, the first thing that they had done in preparation, they knew Croxton's Raiders were coming, so they had pulled up the majority of the planking on the bridge, which meant that if Union forces were going to come over, they were going to have to run across the stringers, which are the narrow beams that would run the whole length across the river. And it was a relatively perilous crossing if you were going to try to do that. So they pulled up the planks and they waited for the Union forces to come, and they fired a couple volleys from the home guard fired the volleys at the Union forces. And these Union forces are seasoned veterans. These guys aren't, just brand new cadets. And the home guard at this point is made up primarily of elderly men that weren't able to go off with the troops or very young boys. Now, the University of Alabama at that time was a military college designed to help train officers. So they had a whole series of cadets that packed up their gear and they came down all the way to the intersection of what's now Greensboro and University. And as those Union forces were working their way across the bridge and coming up the hill from the river, they got to the top, and the cadets fired supposedly one volley at the Union forces. And we have some ACC, Alabama Cadet Corps buttons that came off of this block. I don't know if you can see those very well or not. My hands are shaking enough that it's probably tough to read them. But anyways, they fire one volley at the Union forces, and their commander tells them to retreat back to the university, get all of their gear, and leave the university. And they head all the way over to Shelby Ironworks, and they're sent over to work in various places, protecting bridges and other things from the future advance of Croxton's Raiders. But the tax and kind shop that I mentioned earlier, there was a home guard captain in charge of that facility. And to ensure that the Union forces didn't capture all of those supplies that were held in the tax and kind building, he took the oil lamps, spread them all over everything, and burned it all. So by that point, they had already moved all the POWs out of the facility and sent them to various other locations. Now, that POW facility has a very interesting tie to one of the most notorious POW prisons of the Civil War, and that's Andersonville over in Georgia, where so many soldiers were held, and a lot of them died from the deplorable conditions. conditions were deplorable, whether you were a Union soldier in a Confederate prison or a Confederate soldier in a Union prison up north. There's just as many letters about how bad it was in Pennsylvania and other places for Confederate soldiers. So the person that was put in charge of the facility in Tuscaloosa was a gentleman named Heinrich Wurz. And Heinrich was a Swiss immigrant. He had come to the United States, settled in Massachusetts, worked in a furniture shop before he left and became a medical assistant and moved south. I believe he was in Kentucky. And when the war broke out, he joined the effort. And he was wounded at Bull Run, and one of his arms had been immobilized, and he was forced to walk around with his arm tucked into his jacket. So Heinrich Wurz becomes more well known as Henry Wurz, and he was the commandant first here and then at Andersonville. And he is the only person that was charged with war crimes and hanged at the end of the Civil War. But the story goes that when he came to Tuscaloosa and took over the facility, his first words to the guards were, "Shoot the first blank Yankee that sticks his head out of a window." So,
Whoa.
Yeah, pretty tough. Pretty tough.
That's intense.
Yeah. That block was also the site of the very first bank of the state. And when, in the early 1800s, when the country was brand new, banking was predominantly private, and it was a free-for-all. There were really no standards. People were losing money left and right. And Andrew Jackson actually ran on a platform of reforming all of the banking system in the United States. And they established a series of banks of the state. And there was one in Mobile, there was one in Tuscaloosa, there was one in Decatur. I think there may have been one in Montgomery. I'm trying to remember all the different places. But banks of the state were set up with the idea that they would be controlled by a board established by the legislature. And the majority of those board members were actually made up of members of the legislature, with the idea that these people were elected to their positions and they were uncorruptible and they would be much better. Well, that was not the case. And so, some of them were some of the worst of the scoundrels that were running around taking advantage of banks at the time. So there's a story that Dr. Malone uncovered for us of one of the members of the legislature who signed himself a loan for, I believe it was about $25,000. So a very substantial sum at that time. And the loan, he co-signed Mr. Sunshine and Mr. Moonshine. He was caught. He was thrown in prison. He bribed one of the guards and got out, and he took off. And when he took off, he went all the way to Texas, which at the time was its own free state, free country. And when it came time for Texas to join the Union, one of the requirements was that the state pay back all the money that this gentleman stole from Alabama from the bank. So for Texas to become one of the states in our union, they had to pay back this guy's thievery. But I thought that was another great story for the block.
So he used the names Mr. Sunshine and Mr. Moon?
Mr. Moonshine and Mr. Sunshine to co-sign for the loan that he was given.
Okay. Yeah, those sound like fake names to me.
Yeah, I think so.
That's a giveaway. That's very funny.
So these are just some of the things that, come out of archaeology, whether it's historic or prehistoric. And again, it isn't just these individual artifacts and how neat they are. It's the stories that they tell. So several years back, we were working on a project in Trussville, Alabama. Trussville needed to build a new football stadium for their high school. And one of our staff members, Joel Watkins, was leading up the project. And they were excavating an area in the northwest corner of where this was going to be built, and they found a fire hearth and a storage pit and some other evidence that showed that there had been a habitation right there at that location. And when they started excavating the fire hearth, they realized that it was a roasting pit. And in the bottom of the roasting pit was remnants of what had been a deer haunch that had been wrapped in leaves and placed into the roasting pit to cook. In the storage pit nearby, they had found a intact pot that was full of acorn meat. And, the two indicate that folks were living there. They were roasting food. They had this storage pit in place with materials. So they weren't planning to leave anywhere. And in fact, they were in the very middle of roasting this deer haunch. Well, just adjacent to this area, we ended up finding two sets of human remains. And again, the story that comes from all of this is pretty incredible. We know that at the end of the woodland period, there were Mississippian people moving most likely out of the Mississippi Valley and coming into first West Alabama, where they established Moundville, and it becomes this massive city with traders going all over what would become the United States. And they have other folks that are moving east and settling other areas. And at one point during this time, we know that there is quite a bit of conflict that's occurring between these encroaching populations and the populations that had already been here. So the majority of the artifacts that we find at this site are related to the indigenous population that had been here early on. But these two individuals, we found projectile points in association with the burials. And when I say projectile points, I mean arrowheads. And they were classic Mississippian arrowheads. And what we think happened was this event occurred at the time of the transition where the Mississippian folks were moving into Alabama and either integrating the people that were already here, or in a lot of instances, conflicting with these people and forcing them out of what had been their homes. And it looks like what happened was somebody came in and raided this home, killed two of the individuals, and they didn't even have a chance to finish roasting their dinner and left them for dead. And probably there were other family members that came back and buried these individuals. But, these are the kind of stories that help us to understand our history and help us to recognize how important our heritage is. And there's so many of these stories out there. For instance, here at Moundville, we have been working here at Moundville since the late 1800s. There have been archaeological excavations going on. And you would think at this point that we would know just about everything there is to know about Moundville. But just in the last few years, we found another mound that we didn't even know was here. So, as technology changes and new things come out, there's all kinds of new ways to approach understanding archaeological sites and interpreting archaeological sites. And again, that gets back to this whole thing about preservation. We want to preserve archaeological sites as best as we can, because we never know what type of technology is going to be coming that will help us to interpret these down the road. So it's a lot of fun to be an archaeologist. It's, always really, really interesting, at least until you get buried in paperwork. But it's something that there's a right way and there's a wrong way to do it. And we really love the opportunity to work with folks to learn what they know, because there's so many people out there that know things that nobody else does. Folks that have looked into their own history, folks that have done experimental archaeology, folks that know where things are that nobody else does. And all of these things are great for us to learn about. The thing is, we just want folks to be able to do it in a really constructive way.
Well, we have a question, Matt. When and why did you decide to be an archaeologist?
uh, when I was about 5 years old, I was bound and determined I was going to be a paleontologist. I love dinosaurs. And I was always out in the yard trying to find dinosaur bones or doing different things that would teach me a little bit more about paleontology. And as time went on, I kind of realized that paleontology was going to be a little difficult. So I decided I wanted to be a truck driver. And I learned everything there was to learn about Kenworths and Peterbilts and Mack trucks. And I loved everything about trucks. And then it came time to grow up a little bit more. And I realized that, I was most interested in the stories that came from things like historic research and archaeology. And I grew up in a house that was built in 1836. And next door was my grandmother's house that was built in 1789. Um, so
Wow.
I had, 1765, before the Revolution. My family didn't acquire the house until 1789, but we always had, things, antiques or artifacts floating around that intrigued me. Things that I didn't know what they were until, I started doing some research and realized. And I've developed a love for all of all of it, artifacts and the historic background and the stories that you could develop. And that was, as soon as I got to college, that's exactly what I went into. Never changed my major, and I've loved it ever since. I was very lucky to get to come to Alabama too, though, because I grew up in New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, it's very difficult to excavate an archaeological site in the wintertime. But in
Oh,
Alabama,
I bet.
you can do it 365 days a year, and it's beautiful.
Well, Catherine Edge, director of the Transportation Museum, said that she loved having these artifacts that you were showing us in the museum to celebrate the Tuscaloosa bicentennial. Do you want to talk about how, like with archaeology, you all collect all these artifacts, but then they go to museums? Do you want to talk a little bit about how that process works?
Sure. So the majority of what we do is cultural resource management work. So I mentioned how when they were building the embassy suites, we went in and did the archaeology. That was mandated by the fact that the property had been acquired through a federal grant. And if there's federal dollars involved, or there's federal property involved, or tribal property, then the people that are developing the project have to consider cultural resources, archaeology, standing structures, cultural things that are important to a community. So one of the guidelines that's included in cultural resource law is that everything that is excavated has to be curated in accordance with federal guidelines. So every can tab, every broken piece of glass, every brick fragment, every nail, every piece of fire-cracked rock or flake from the production of an arrowhead or tiny little broken sherd from a pot, all of that we retain. And we curate all of that in the University of Alabama Museum's Research and Collections Department. And we have multiple facilities where all of these things are kept. And it's just an absolutely incredible facility. And then if researchers want to come in and look at the materials, they can. And we'll have the original photographs from the project. We'll have all the field notes from it. We'll have all the artifacts from it. And those researchers can go in and look at those materials. When we are digging an archaeological site, we are, for all intents and purposes, destroying it. There's no other way to say it. But if we do it in this constructive way where it can be recreated by future researchers and we're documenting everything appropriately, then it's done in a way that's very constructive. And if a researcher wants to come in and work with these materials, they can. If a museum wants to have these on display, they can. There are regulations in place for certain aspects of that. And we obviously don't just let anybody come in and look at the records or go in to look at the artifacts. They have to have certain qualifications to be able to do it, because it's very easy to destroy these things. It's very easy to cause things that we would lose if somebody dropped them or did something else to them very easily. So we have to make sure that we're very controlled with how we handle these. But we have researchers come in from all over the world to look at these materials, and right now we have a lot of materials on loan. Bill Allen is the archaeological collections manager, and Bill does a great job of working with a lot of the different museums around the state of Alabama and beyond, so that they can have access to these materials. And the work that was done at the Transportation Museum developing the exhibit that they had down there was fantastic. Catherine and Brandon Thompson, who's now the director of the Gorgas House, and Bill Allen and a lot of different folks got together and did a great job of developing this exhibit that's been down there now for over a year. I think it just came down, hence the reason I have the majority of the artifacts with me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a really incredible exhibit.
Well, we have about 9 more minutes, Matt. So, do you have any other artifacts that you want to tell us about?
I've brought only a few more that I thought were kind of interesting. Let's see. This glass is just a standard tumbler. It's kind of, I don't know if you noticed, it's a little bit yellow. That's actually radioactive material that was used in the coloring of the glass. And this was a very popular type of glass back in the day. It doesn't irradiate people to the point where it would make them sick. But I would imagine that the manufacturer of this probably was not in good shape if they were handling I think it's radium that was used to develop the glass. Let's see. We've got a jug back here. This is a decorative jug, but as you go around Tuscaloosa, let me get that where people can see it. As you go around Tuscaloosa, there are a lot of indications of the history of Tuscaloosa. And, we see names on things that we don't really think of. There's always something Ferry Road, or there's something Mill Road, or there's something Factory Road. All of those names stem from some type of facility that was there in the past. And one of the things that really got me was Jug Factory Road. Jug Factory Road was named for the jug factory that was on a creek out there. There was a mill that was set up, water-powered mill, that they produced earthenware, pitchers and jugs and other things. And there were several items found on the Bank of the State block that had been manufactured at that facility. One of the things, which I wish I had brought it with me, that I had no idea what it was, and we thought about it for the longest time before somebody recognized it, was a small ceramic vessel that was about 4 inches tall. And in the middle of it, it had a pintle, a section that stuck up in the middle of the jug, or in the middle of this ceramic item. And we had no idea what it was. Well, before refrigeration, people had what were called pie safes. And pie safes were pieces of furniture that you could put things in and close the doors on and keep the bugs off of. Well, it's difficult to keep ants from getting into a pie safe unless you have one of these ceramic items that allows you to set the legs of your pie safe into the ceramic bowl thing. The leg sits up on top of the pintle in the middle of it, so it's a little bit higher than the bottom, and then you fill the bottom of the bowl with water so an ant can't get to the leg. And it's an ingenious element that we don't think of today, and it took us forever to sort out what it was. But we always we think about technology today and how advanced we are with our iPhones and computers and everything else, but people have been so innovative throughout the entire history of human evolution. It's just absolutely incredible.
That is the truth. So we have some questions, Matt. We'll see if we can run through these in the last couple minutes. So, are University of Alabama students able to work on your excavations?
Absolutely. We have several students that work for us, and it isn't just the excavations. We have lab work where we're doing the analysis on various things. They're incredibly interesting to be able to not just work in the field, but to also handle these things once we get back to the lab and we're working on processing the materials. So yeah, we have quite a few students that work with us, and we'd love to have more. So if there's any students out there that are interested in learning more about archaeology, come on down.
And Allie from the Alabama Museum of Natural History says, if anyone is interested in giving, I'd check out the museum's expedition program. So do you have any thoughts on the expedition every year?
The expedition this summer, I think, is going to be here at Moundville, so we're excited about it. There's going to be a really neat project right on the banks of the Black Warrior River. It's a beautiful location. The museum expedition is set up for middle school, high school, and adults to come in. We have a lot of teachers that come in for the last week of it that are able to get credit for working in archaeology and as one of the sciences. So it's a great program, and Allie does a great job organizing that.
All right. And then Lindsay says her nephew Keelan, I hope I pronounced that right, wants to know what time period is your favorite to study? And he's 6 years old. So
Okay.
this is coming from a 6-year-old.
All right. So my particular favorite time is right about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And it's a time when populations are starting to get so dense. There's so many people living on the landscape that being a typical hunter-gatherer is not easy. So early on, when folks first came to North America, they were hunter-gatherers. They would follow migratory herds of elk or reindeer or bison or even mastodons and mammoths. And as they worked across the landscape, they were hunting animals for their survival, and they were gathering nuts and different things. And by the end of this time period, there gets to be a lot more people around. And we start to see a time when people are doing things like settling in one location for much longer periods of time. And there's a lot more conflict that's occurring at this time. So we start to see evidence of people having battles, people raiding each other's home sites and other things. And to me, that transitional period between when folks are hunter-gatherers and when they start to get into horticulture and eventually agriculture is incredibly interesting to me, because they're trading over massive distances. They're sharing information, they're sharing material, and they're doing things that they had never done before, whether that's coming up with new things to eat and taking advantage of things like shellfish in the rivers in Alabama. We've got some environmental changes going on at that time that may influence the way that they interact. And all of that is just a fascinating time for me. Now, I have to say, I also love the stuff associated with the first peopling.
Looks.
Oh,
Yeah, there.
I'm back. I don't know
Back.
if you can hear me or not.
No, we got you back.
That early time period is fantastic for me to look at as well, and to learn about how people first came to the New World is great. So I hope you take the opportunity to learn some of these things. It's a great field to study.
Well, I think that is an excellent. Thank you for asking it, and that might be a good question to end on because we're right about at our time. Matt, are there any other things that you point people to? Any websites that you want to point people to learn more information about what y'all do?
All right. Well, I'm afraid I can't hear any of the talking anymore, but thank you very much for letting me be on.
Can you hear me now, Matt?
I really appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a great day. Please stay safe. And if you've got questions about archaeology, come talk to us. Call us or shoot us an email, and we'd love to hear your stories and learn about your interest in archaeology. So thank you.
All right. Well, if we're losing Matt's audio, I guess I'll just wrap it up here. So that's going to do it for our talk on archaeology, and I hope everybody enjoyed seeing the artifacts and learning about history and hearing the stories. We'll be doing this every day, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m., and each day will feature a different topic. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about natural history, so make sure to visit the Alabama Museum of Natural History's Facebook page at 10 a.m. And for a full live stream schedule and links to our coloring book and discovering Alabama's online educational resources, including their free episodes and teacher guides, I will pull this up as well. You can visit, see if it'll come up, this website here on the screen, museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. Thank you to everybody who was watching and asking questions, and thanks for visiting UA Museums from your home.
Thanks, everybody. Roll Tide.